Hi, everybody. So, I wanted to talk about something that isn't talked about enough. Many of us are familiar with La Conquista, and many have the erroneous idea that people just hopped on ships and went to the West Indies. But the reality is that the Spanish crown quickly realized that they were going to have to be very organized for what they wanted to do on these islands. And one of the ways that they did that was to create La Casa de Contratación de Indias. The Catholic monarchs wrote this order in 1503 establishing La Casa de Contratación. So this institution began as just a regulatory agency by the government to control who went to the islands, what went to the islands, and what came back. And the whole purpose was taxes. They wanted to make sure that all of these merchants paid taxes and didn't bring in any contraband, any products or people that were not allowed in and out of the islands and in and out of the kingdom. But this agency ended up growing to immense proportions. It became a court, a school, a market, and the ministry de la India. Pedro Martí de Aglería called this La Casa del Océano. And as you see here in the image, these are all the boats waiting to be inspected by La Casa de Contratación. So it was basically customs at that time. Like when you fly in from the airport and you have to go into customs. As part of its role as customs house, they even designed a formula to weigh the ships and see how many tons each ship could hold. This allowed for better safety, for insurance purposes, and for tax purposes. These calculations also helped them prevent smuggling to a certain extent. Part of those inspections was inspecting the actual ship, making sure it was in good condition and travel worthy. The ships and trading companies had to have their own logo. These logos were then put onto all the documentation for every single ship and every single document. The ships were inspected several times to ensure that everything that was on it was allowed, and that once it departed, it didn't have any extra people or any extra goods. Casa de Contratación was also in charge of making sure that whoever went on these ships was allowed to go there. There were restrictions about who could go to the Indies, who could not. Many who applied for a license, because yes, you had to get a license to go on these trips, had to provide proof of lineage to make sure that they were pure-blooded. So along with their license to travel, they also had to obtain a license of blood purity. At times, they also had to prove how long their families had been in the Christian faith. In addition to the main traveler, the relatives and servants and anybody else accompanying the main traveler had to be listed, and they also could not fall into any of those prohibited categories. This example here, Juan de Lizarragas, this was his coat of arms and was listed as a servant to Pablo Contreras, and it was used to demonstrate his nobility, his lineage, and his blood purity. By 1539, we see some examples of the kind of people who were prohibited from traveling to the Indies. It says, provisión para que ningún hijo ni nieto de quemado, someone unalived by being burned alive, sin reconciliación de judío ni moro, por la Santa Inquisición, ni ninguno nuevamente convertido de moro ni judío, pueda pasar a las Indias. Once a person was determined to be qualified, they were given a license. So these are examples of licenses that were given at the time. This license was, from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody who knows, this would be written into the main book of La Casa de Contratación. Then it was written and copied into the book for the ship, and then the person would also get their own copy. Because La Casa de Contratación dealt with so many different topics, it became the jurisdiction of everything that happened at sea for any ship going towards the Indies. So any murders, any disputes that happened while en route were resolved once they came back a la Casa de Contratación. And because of these disputes, it eventually ended up having its own prison. So it would take care of civil and criminal complaints, and it would also give sentences if needed. And this court was separate from La Audiencia Real, which heard cases in the islands and in the Spanish territory. It also became responsible with designing ways to reduce risk while traveling to the West Indies. One of their techniques was to allow ships to travel in packs, basically in fleets, called flotillas in Spanish. And this is why we don't see many ships coming by themselves. And the ships that were alone became a sign of piracy. All of this data eventually became a storehouse for La Casa de Contratación. It became a center of maps and geographical information for all of these areas. It quickly evolved into a school, as we see here. This is an announcement. It states that Compendio del arte de navegar, astrólogo y matemático, cosmógrafo de la Majestad Católica de Don Felipe II, Rey de España, y su catedrático de cosmografía en la Casa de la Contratación de las Indias de la ciudad de Sevilla. And if you notice below, this was for 1581. So a compendio was kind of like an exposition, a talk, a small class, but we see that expanded not only to navigation, as it says here, ha mandado se enseñe en esta ciudad de Sevilla las materias de navegación, artillería, fortificación, escuadrones, etc. And it says que en la Casa de la Contratación de las Indias, el día 22 del mes de noviembre, it became a whole university. Those who went to these schools actually became expert technicians in the area of their expertise. And because these trips were money loaded, they needed to make sure of the accuracy as much as possible. That meant that they began to be at the forefront of scientific and technical discoveries. And this later would form the Spanish Armada because they became so advanced, the Spanish became so advanced in their nautical skills that no one else in the world could beat them. La Casa de Contratación was meticulous in all of its records. As we see here, from 1495 onward, there was records about everything that was spent, everything that was brought in and brought out. So this is why El Archivo General de las Indias has so much documentation. This was meticulous. And to this day, we're still discovering documents because they were exhaustive in the way that they made sure that everything was taken into account. It doesn't mean that people didn't slip through, but they tried their hardest to make sure that no one did.